The argument about American decline has been quite fashionable. It really took off at the time of the 2007-2008 financial shock and Great Recession that followed. The idea was America was in decline, economically, politically, militarily, culturally, and so forth, and that rising powers, especially China, were now what mattered most, and this decline was almost inevitable. The reality is that that argument was grossly exaggerated. Arguments about American decline have been cyclical. They existed in the 1930s when people said that the authoritarians, the totalitarians, whether fascists or Soviet-style communists, were the wave of the future. But there were even arguments like that in the 19th century, and that again at times during the Cold War, that the Soviets were eating our lunch, for example, or after the withdrawal from Vietnam in 1975. Well, the reality is that in terms of the way we measure power across all the different dimensions, population size, strength of the economy, financial markets, agricultural wealth, natural resources, land area, research universities, science, entrepreneurship, international influence, the countless areas, energy resources, for example, which altogether represent American material powers, that despite some attrition in America's relative economic performance compared to some others, America's role in the world remains unique. The U.S. is third in the world in population with 320 million people and will remain so indefinitely. But by all the other measurements, gross domestic product per capita, energy production, natural resources, research universities, military power projection, science, technology, entrepreneurship, startups, what have you, the U.S. remains unmatched by any other country in the world. Now, we have a problem. Our problem is ideational, not material. Our underlying material strengths remain profound. But by ideational, I mean policy, resolve, choices, leadership. Those things matter most, so that America's role in the world and its strength is really contingent on the choices we make. But I think all too many observers in politics and academia have tended to be far too pessimistic about America's underlying strengths. Now, related to that, and it was especially fashionable half a dozen years ago or more, really the latter part of the last decade, with America embroiled in Iraq and Afghanistan, which had become, in one form or another, quagmires by the middle of the last decade, and with the financial shocks at the end of the last decade, and with the rise of China and its double-digit economic growth for 3 decades, which, by the way, has fallen drastically in recent years. There were those who said, well, China is going to become the new great power. Well, that was always a great exaggeration. Even today, America's total gross domestic product as a share of the world total remains at about 24% of the entire gross domestic product of the entire world, and that of the Chinese is barely more than half of that, probably closer to 17% or so, based on market exchange rates. Also, if you look at purchasing power or per capita or gross domestic product per capita, our margin over the Chinese is more like 6 or 7 or 8 to 1. Now, the Chinese rise has been extraordinary, unprecedented in human history, but they're now trapped in what's called the middle income trap. They have dangerous bubbles in their financial markets, housing, budget deficits, and so forth. And the Chinese are not going to outpace the United States economically for the foreseeable future.